I'll just check if we are live. Okay, I think we are live. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Caravan. My name is Ishan Sharma, and you are listening to the Caravan special lecture for September 2023. Um, as of now, we have lost the count of the lectures that we have organized here. So this must be 300 something lecture today. And this lecture is very special because we are going to talk about something very contemporary, something who is around for a while. And he died in 1960s, but the ghost of that figure haunts and gives inspiration to modern day happenings in India. And I think that is the idea is shared by a lot of Indians who live abroad also. So it is important to highlight before we start today's session. The session is on V.D. Savarkar and his idea of history and violence. And for that, I think we have a very special guest, Professor Vinayak Chaturvedi. He's a professor of history at University of California, Irvine. He's the author of Peasant Pasts, History and Memory in Western India, and the editor of Mapping Subaltern Studies in the Post-Colonial, and the Pandemic Perspectives on Asia that came out in 2020. His most recent work is V.D. Savarkar, Writings on History and Violence, and that came out in 2022, last year, which not only understands, but also advises not to condemn a figure like Savarkar or any historical figure for that matter. If we have to critique, we have to read, understand. So today, the title of today's lecture is The Savarkar Moment, Reflections on Writing History and Violence. So there's so much to unravel, uncover in today's conversation. But before we start the session, I would request everybody who is listening to us to keep an open mind before listening to the lecture, before listening to any conversation with historians, and try to understand, try to critically evaluate whatever you listen. And we will be hosting a Q&A after the lecture. So stay back for asking your questions. You can always send in those questions via YouTube live chat. I'll be happy to take those questions, and looking forward to that. Thank you so much, Professor Chaturvedi, for accepting the invitation. It's truly an honor for us at Caravan to host you this morning for you to deliver this lecture. And without further ado, I would like to request you to share the screen and take it from here.
Yeah, I'll put the screen on. So I just wanted to begin by thanking Ishan for his invitation to present this lecture, but also for the hard work that he and his group have been doing for a number of years now in allowing us to rethink history in the public space. And I think this is an important aspect more generally in thinking about why it's important to study Savarkar's interpretation of history overall. And I'll be talking about how I became interested in writing about Savarkar's interpretation of history, and why I'm calling this the Savarkar moment. And so the plan is to kind of give you a bit of background regarding how I got to this project in the first place. And secondly, to kind of go through some of the key arguments that I lay out in the book. But what I also like to advise listeners is that, a lot of what I'm talking about is presenting Savarkar's interpretation, because oftentimes that interpretation has not actually been studied or examined, and why it's important for people who aren't. And so in many ways, the book is a conversation with friends and colleagues on the left who have not read Savarkar. And so in many ways, it's kind of, and I'll explain why it's sort of a double-edged sword as someone who's working on Savarkar with in mind with what is happening in the contemporary climate in India and globally today. So I just wanted to kind of preface my lecture with those sorts of things. And there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions, and I'm happy to stick around as long as necessary to answer everyone's questions, okay? So I'm going to actually share my screen because I have a few slides that I wanted to show you. So I wanted to begin by giving a background to the set of political and intellectual concerns that shaped the direction of my project in writing about Savarkar in the first place. I'll give you a bit of background regarding my own kind of work and how I sort of got to the point of actually now writing about Savarkar over the last decade and a half or so. I began as a social historian working on the Gujarat countryside, the area between Ahmedabad and Baroda, and really thinking about the development of nationalism and the direction of nationalism in the countryside, which ended up culminating into my book, Peasant Pass, in 2007. But as I was finishing the final research for that book in 2002, Gujarat, of course, experienced a great deal of communal violence. And this was seen by scholars, activists, writers, journalists as a major turning point for the rise of Hindutva in India. And what struck me was this kind of binary between this discussion of how Gujarat, which was Gandhi's Gujarat, which was non-violent, suddenly became violent as part of Hindutva's violence, right? And this was the kind of the generic kind of explanation that was given over and over again. And it struck me, having done research in Gujarat, that there was something not completely correct about this assessment, given the fact that there was extensive amounts of violence in Gujarat during the nationalist movement in the first place. And so that got me thinking about how do we interpret this rise of Hindutva if we don't follow the trajectory that's given by the kind of explanations that were dominant in India at the time. But also simultaneously, as this was happening in a year before, in 2001, I'd already started reading a lot of Savarkar's work in relation to an interview that I was doing, conducted in Gwalior with one of regarding one of the individuals involved in the murder of Mahatma Gandhi, and I was Dr. Parchere, and I had already been reading Savarkar. So when 2002 happened, and I was reading the explanations, for me there was something that seemed to be missing in the analysis in terms of thinking about how we should construct an explanation for the rise of Hindutva in the first place, right? However, what was also interesting at this point was thinking about, thinking about Gandhi, because in terms of, if you're talking about nationalism in Gujarat, you're also thinking about the nature of and the role of Gandhi during the nationalist movement in Gujarat. And it struck me that the body of work on Gandhi from across the political spectrum, there was very little on Gandhi's main interlocutors at the time. So at one level, there was very little on Ambedkar coming out in terms of thinking about how Ambedkar's ideas were informing and shaping Gandhi's ideas. But there was also very little on, and probably with the exception of Dhananjay Keer and Anthony Perel and maybe a handful of others, who had actually thought of the role of Savarkar in shaping Gandhi's ideas, especially, Anthony Perel's arguments for Hind Swaraj struck me as very important, that Gandhi's seminal text was, in fact, a conversation or a dialogue in part shaped by his interactions with Savarkar in London in 1909. So all of these things were happening, and it was leading me to thinking about Savarkar's role in this. But Savarkar himself had laid out certain kinds of arguments about, for example, he compared Hindutva to a banyan tree. And he said that the seed of a banyan tree is smaller than a mustard seed, but it has the potential for great expanse. So if you've seen a banyan tree, you know what I'm talking about. That he said that no matter if you cut any limb, if you cut any branch, if you cut any root, it doesn't destroy the tree. The tree survives. But what he leaves out of this kind of metaphor for thinking about Hindutva is that the banyan tree also destroys everything underneath it. Very little can live under a banyan tree, right? So in a sense, when we're thinking about Savarkar's own metaphor for thinking about Hindutva, in many ways, it's quite apt, right? That there can be no other life except Hindutva that lives under the banyan tree, right? So as I started this research, one of the things that, and as I started presenting the research very early on, around 2007-8, what became really apparent to me was that there was a great deal of resistance to actually thinking about Savarkar as a thinker or as an intellectual even, right? And this also struck me as really interesting. So not only had scholars who had been writing about Gandhi not engaging with Savarkar's thought extensively, but there was also a resistance and suspicion that if you're working and reading Savarkar, that somehow you are sympathetic to Savarkar's ideas, right? And so that struck me as really important kind of moment as well, that how does one then actually write about Savarkar? And the understanding was that you were only write about Savarkar if you're celebrating Savarkar, right? So how do you actually then engage with this thinker's ideas, or even to call him a thinker, or even to think of, or even call him an intellectual, right? And to say that Savarkar was someone who contributed to political thought or political debates or the history of ideas overall was sort of seen as anathema, right? And I thought this was kind of also really important in not recognizing the kind of momentum and strength that was building around Hindutva and why it was becoming more and more popular in India, right? However, there were two thinkers who really, I thought, who started writing about the need for figures on the left to actually read about figures on the right. One was, of course, G.P. Deshpande, who taught at JNU. And towards the end of his life, he started writing about Marathi, the role of Maratha intellectuals in shaping political thought, and especially the need, what he said, for what he called a Savarkar debate among the left in the 21st century, right? And so what I was looking for and what I appreciated about Deshpande's writings was that he was someone who was actually willing to say that, look, it's important for the left to actually engage with Savarkar's ideas if we are to figure out a way to kind of challenge, contest, resist, or critique the emergence of Hindutva rather than simply ignoring it, right? And so for me, that was an important moment. The other intellectual who I thought provided a very important insight to this was Perry Anderson. And Perry Anderson also, in his writings, had started engaging with figures on the right and sort of saying that the left had ceded its terrain, and what needed to be done was to actually engage and think about how to contest certain sets of ideas through interpretation first, right? And I thought these were kind of came at an important moment for me as I was conceptualizing this project and thinking about the role of Savarkar's ideas, right? But the more I read about Savarkar in the beginning of the 20th century, the more I realized that there were already figures who had dealt with this problem and engaged with this problem throughout the 1920s, 30s as well, right? I mean, the most, and I write about this in my book, is, you know, the figure who surprised me the most on this was M.N. Roy, and M.N. Roy's own kind of, at one level, acknowledgement of Savarkar's important role in his thinking, arguing that Savarkar helped him when he was a teenager to thinking about to becoming a revolutionary, but also condemning some of Savarkar's ideas as well, his ideas about Muslims, his ideas about the construction of a Hindu nation, and so on. And for me, that was an important moment as well, of sort of the revelation that the ways in which we are interpreting Savarkar today is, of course, informed by the contemporary politics, as it rightly should be. However, as a historian, my goal and objective in many ways is to also understand the change in the kind of his ideas, Savarkar's ideas, but how Savarkar has been interpreted over the course of the 20th century and the 21st century. What is the legacies and resonance of Savarkar's ideas over this period of time, rather than sort of not doing that, right? And for me, that was kind of an important moment as well. Sorry, before I move on. Now, if we fast forward to today, right? Fast forward to what I'm calling the Savarkar moment, right? And part of what I'm talking about is that over the last few years, there's been a rapid transformation that's taken place vis-a-vis Savarkar. Savarkar is everywhere, right? And I wanted to begin with this photo called Welcome Savarkar Restaurant, which serves North Indian, South Indian, and Chinese food. This is a photo taken by my colleague, Tapsi Mathur. This is a photo outside of Muzaffarnagar in UP. And here you see Savarkar is now, the restaurant is named after Savarkar. But if you're just following contemporary news in India, you know that Savarkar is everywhere. You not only have Savarkar restaurants, but you have flyovers in Karnataka. You have the Veer Savarkar International Airport in Port Blair in the Andamans. This is an image of a Savarkar lake and park in Gwalior in Madhya Pradesh. Here you have at JNU campus, Veer Savarkar Marg, VD Savarkar Marg. Here's the Veer Savarkar cycle store in Gujarat, and in Mumbai, of course, the Versova Bandra Sea Link was renamed after Savarkar as well. So Savarkar is now everywhere. There's also anticipation that if the BJP wins the next elections, one of the things that it is going to do, and these are images of currency that you can find on social media, and also the Hindu Mahasabha wants Savarkar's pictures to replace Gandhi's image, right? And so you have this kind of ubiquity of Savarkar spreading and Savarkar's name that is already part of what's happening in India. But what's really interesting to me in what I'm calling the Savarkar moment, what do I mean by moment, right? And why did I choose moment to talk about? Savarkar himself writes about the importance of any kind of historical moment, right? And recognizing that the goal is to try to achieve that point. It could be, he says, even a brief instant. That's all that's all that actually matters. However, a moment can also be a definite stage or a period, a turning point of coming events. It can be an element of a complex conceptual entity. In mathematics and physics, a moment is related to momentum or something that's transitory, right? So I'm leaving it open-ended in terms of the title, but I wanted to kind of capture this period in which not only is Savarkar's presence felt in terms of these name changes of streets and buildings and roads. I mean, almost every major city now has either a Savarkar street or a Savarkar flyover. And yes, this is common for many nationalist figures overall, but this is all happening simultaneously. But for me, what was really interesting is looking at these images of Me Savarkar, these hats, these signs, these placards of these women who are declaring themselves, saying that I am Savarkar, right? And it's also this campaign that was happening last year called Everywhere Savarkar campaign, with the idea that Savarkar is going to be everywhere, right? And each of us is Savarkar, right? And I thought this was really interesting. And it's sort of connected to one of Savarkar's central ideas about the movement of the Hindu spirit that travels across time and space. And when I saw these images, it kind of made me really think about the ways in which Savarkar is being interpreted and absorbed, and his ideas are seen as being so important that you have individuals who are declaring themselves Savarkar. Now, I think it's also very interesting regarding this whole issue of why these women are photographed and why they have adopted this idea of thinking about themselves as Savarkar. And one of the key things in Savarkar's writings is that a Hindu warrior there's no discrimination between a Hindu warrior being a woman or a man. And so here you have sort of a current manifestation of one of his arguments in terms of the traveling of the Hindu spirit. So what I wanted to do is kind of go through some of the key concepts and conceptualizations that I have, but also to answer the key question, why did I write about Savarkar's definition of history, right? What was it about history that was so important, right? And the question for me was that in all these writings on Hindutva, one of the things that I thought was missing in the debates and conversations was actually an understanding of Savarkar's definition of Hindutva, right? It seemed Savarkar, we know, wasn't the individual who conceptualized the term. It was already a part of 19th century Bengali debates. And there was a book in 1893 by Chandranath Basu called Hindutva that came out. So we know that Savarkar is not the first to have conceptualized the term. However, in the 20th century, he certainly is the individual who helped promote and spread and conceptualize what he meant by Hindutva, right? And that's what I thought was really missing in this kind of literature is what is Savarkar's definition, right? And in all these years, the only place that I have found where he actually defines what Hindutva is actually in Essentials of Hindutva, which came out in 1923. We're in the 100-year anniversary year of this book. This is a front cover of the original, the first edition of the book. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that if you look very closely, initially this was a book titled Hinduism, and whether that was probably a misprint, and you have sort of these corrections glued on top of the original title. The only place I have found the original book without this kind of changing of the title is actually, there's one copy at the British Library. So this misprint still exists. And so if you're at the British Library, you can order it and see the original. But Savarkar defines Hindutva, he says, is that Hindutva is not a word, but a history. And I got stuck on this sentence. I mean, it appears on page, I think, 2 or 3 of Essentials of Hindutva. And I got stuck in sort of thinking about what does he mean that it is not a word, but a history, right? And so I spent a lot of time unpacking the sentence. In fact, the entire book in a certain way is kind of trying to understand what Savarkar means by saying that Hindutva is a history, right? And why history is the way to understand Hindutva, or why is history the equivalent of Hindutva for him, right? But he also wants to clarify what he means, right, by negation, right? What it is not. He said it's not a spiritual history, and it's not a religious history. He says it's not a detailed history, it's not a factual history, nor is it an archival or researched history, right? It's not a complete or total history. So he's telling you all the things that it is not. But then he finally gets to the point where he says it is a history in full, right? So now these are very confusing categories within the English language, right? Even its construction, Hindutva is not a word, but a history, is an awkward construction. To say that Hindutva is a history in full is also an awkward construction within the English language. But what's important to note is that he writes this in English first, right? He consciously chooses to write this work, perhaps the most important work on laying out his arguments on Hindutva in English rather than Marathi or any other Indian language, right? And one of the key ways of thinking about Hindutva overall, and I'll explain what I mean in just a second, is thinking about that this is a compound of 2 words, Hindu and Tattva, right? The essence or essentials. For a long time, scholars thought the etymology was Hindutva plus just the Sanskrit suffix of tva to make it a compound noun. But what does that actually mean? And I suggest, and a few others have actually suggested, that a closer, accurate interpretation is actually thinking about it being a compound of Hindu and Tattva, okay? Now, the title of the first book has Hindutva on it, has Hinduism on it, which was replaced by Hindutva, but it's called Essentials of Hindutva. And here I have the cover page from a later edition of the book, and we'll talk about that in a second. And Savarkar argues that the key thing he's trying to understand is trying to figure out the definition of the Hindu, right? And we'll talk about that in just a second. But what I wanted to show you is, it will be slightly confusing, but just bear with me for just a second, that if we play with the title, we can begin to see the complexity of what Savarkar is perhaps trying to do, okay? He doesn't do what I'm doing here, but it's to kind of give you a sense that if we go back and forth between the languages, what happens to the title, what happens to the meaning of this text, and what happens to Hindutva overall, right? So the book's title is The Essentials of Hindutva. But if we change this and we sort of say, okay, the essentials of the Hindu plus Tattva, which becomes the essentials of the Hindu's Tattva, right? The essentials of the Hindu's essence. Now, and we also know that Tattva's other definition is essentials. So what happens to the Tattva, right, of the Hindu's Tattva? What happens if we change it to the essence of the Hindu's essence? Or if we keep it to the essentials of, instead of Hindutva, he says Hindutva is a history, now it becomes essentials of a history, or the Tattva of a history, or the essentials of a history in full, right? And the reason I'm sort of saying this is that as I started thinking about the title and thinking about these various definitions in the vernacular, but also in English, and the fact he chooses to write in English, that what are these alternative kinds of interpretations of what he's trying to do as part of this project, right? And in many ways, and what I'll talk about is that he spends his entire career unpacking these categories and thinking about what does it mean to be a Hindu at one level, but what does it mean to write about Hindutva in the first place, right? Now, the key thing that Savarkar also says is that Hindutva is actually indefinable, right? So if we think of an essence, how does one define an essence, right? Suddenly Savarkar is now going into if you want to think of it in terms of metaphysics, phenomenology, ontology. But what's interesting is that Savarkar doesn't go in that direction completely, right? He sort of lays out these sets of questions and ideas, but he doesn't kind of unpack them in that way as a philosopher would. Instead, he chooses the discipline of history as his discipline of thinking about how to unpack this category of Hindutva, to the extent that he says Hindutva is a history, right? Now, his definition of Hindu, which comes up, it says a Hindu means a person who regards this land of Bharatvarsh from the Indus to the seas as his fatherland, as well as his holy land, that is the cradle of his religion, right? And that's what he says a Hindu is. A Hindu is an individual who recognizes Bharatvarsh as the fatherland and the holy land. And there's a third category he unpacks, which is motherland. So I think this is, and we'll come back to this in just a second, in terms of what is the history he's writing of the Hindu that allows him to make these sets of claims. So, but before we do that, I wanted to kind of talk about what does he mean by a history in full, because he says a history in full is the complete definition of this idea of Hindutva, right? Now, what struck me as really interesting is that he begins to unpack this meaning of a history in full in his book, The Indian War of Independence of 1857. So this is the first, this is the title page of the 1909 edition of the book. I saw a copy of this that had Savarkar's signature on it on sale at a bookshop in Florida. They were selling it for $20,000, and when I went back on the website, it had already it was no longer there. So I'm assuming it was sold. So that's for me, it was very interesting that this is the book in which Savarkar defines what is a history in full, right? He says writing history, he says, is holy work, right? He elevates the writing of history and calls it holy work in this book. He says to write a full history means necessarily tracing all the events, right, back to their source, back to their motive, right? And so now reading this becomes really interesting, right? Like to write a history in full means tracing all events back to their source, to their motive. Like, how does one actually do this, right? The next question, of course, is what is motive for Savarkar? He defines motive as the innermost desire of individuals, right? These are desiring subjects. These are historical actors, or what he calls desiring subjects. Now, who are these desiring subjects, right? He defines them as chief actors. He uses the terms, they were heroes, they were veer, they were brave, they were warriors, right? So writing a history in full involves seeking out these heroes, the brave hearts, the veer, as a way to study their inner desires and motives. And he says what a historian needs to do is to search for documents that reflect the essence of these desiring subjects. At this point, when I've sort of talked about this, most scholars, most historians will say, well, this is not really history, right? What kind of history is he talking about? And how do we actually understand this? And I'll talk a little bit about Savarkar's methodology, but I want to kind of emphasize the point that Savarkar is staking a claim, right? He's claiming that he, as a historian, can actually find these desiring subjects. He can tell you what their motive was. Even if they're not speaking, he can speak for them. He is an omniscient narrator in that sense. And what he does in this book is he talks about the fact that all of these individuals were revolutionaries. But what he does is he takes this method and sort of applies it for thinking about Hindutva in his later works, right? So I'll get to that in just a second and how he does that in his later works. But so we've talked about history and as part of the title of the book, and why violence, right? So for supporters of Hindutva, some of them have actually contacted me and said, why do you insist on violence as part of this title, right? And my response always is, well, have you read Savarkar, right? I mean, if you've read Savarkar, you know that violence is central to his thought, right? And violence is central to his understanding of how a Hindu should behave, right? So I am not saying this, Savarkar is saying this, and it's really important to kind of underscore that point, that the two, if you were to narrow Savarkar's ideas into a couple of key categories, Hindutva, the Hindu, are certainly two of the main important categories that he's engaging with, concepts that he's really seeking to redefine. But he's also seeking to redefine the very meaning of violence itself, right? So if you want to think of Savarkar as a theorist of violence, who is arguing that it is in the nature, not simply of Hindus, but all mankind, of all humans, right, that violence is a part of our being, of our very essence as well, right? Now, how does he articulate this in his work, right? So he says that his histories document this essence, desires, and motives. But if you understand that the Hindu is here, that himsa is the nature of being a Hindu, then what you can do is look for these moments of violence and immediately understand that this is a Hindu who has participated in this for a certain set of factors and reasons, right? But he also points out that, and he talks about this quite regularly, and especially in Essentials of Hindutva, is that Hindus were the first to colonize the land, right? Colonize Bharatvarsh, colonize Hindustan, colonize India, right? That it was the Hindu who was actually the first to do this. And Hindus used violence against non-Hindus in the act of creating this land, right? And non-Hindus, he says, became Hindus through this violence. So you have Hindus who were dominating over other local populations and converting them to becoming Hindus through this act of violence, right? So this is actually an important kind of moment for me in terms of thinking about Savarkar's own writings, that the Hindu is both the perpetrator and the victim in the very act of becoming a Hindu, right? That it's in the nature of a Hindu to be violent. They perpetuate violence. They perpetuate violence against the non-Hindu, who then becomes a Hindu. So the Hindu is both the perpetrator and the victim within Savarkar's own narrative, okay? Now, one of the things, and he also argues that ahimsa is antithetical to being a Hindu. So that's kind of interesting to think about, that if you propagate nonviolence, that it's actually the opposite of being a Hindu, right? And so this becomes the kind of binary that he is perpetuating in his writings throughout his work, is this relationship of himsa and ahimsa, of who is a proper Hindu and who is not. And I'll talk about that in just a second as well. Now, if you know the story of Prahlad, and Savarkar discusses Vishnu as Narsim, who kills Hiranyakashipu on this topic, right? He says that Prahlad's non-violence against his father did not resolve the problem. It was only when Vishnu came in the form of a lion and not only killed Prahlad's father, but disemboweled him, brutalized him, that Prahlad's persecution stopped, right? So in a sense, it is a critique of both Prahlad and Prahlad's father, right? That Prahlad could not resolve this through nonviolence and peace. In fact, Vishnu had to come and not only kill, but also had to brutally kill. And this is something that Savarkar also discusses for individuals who are perpetuating nonviolence, the kind of death that they should face. Now, in my book, the book is divided into 4 parts, and each part is looking at either 1 or 2 sets of Savarkar's writings and unpacking the key kind of themes and how those themes will keep building on each other moving forward, right? So part 1 looks at Savarkar's first book, which is a translation of Joseph Mazzini's writings, the Italian political theorist and thinker, and taking certain sets of ideas from Mazzini and why it's relevant for Maharashtrians, right? And he writes this in 1907. He takes some of the key ideas from Mazzini's writings and thinking about the themes that we've just been looking at to write the Indian War of Independence of 1857 and 1909. In part 2, I look at essentials of Hindutva and how he's building on certain sets of ideas, but also shifting, right? So this is the important thing. Part 3 looks at his work on the Marathas, Hindu Pad Padshahi, and also his autobiographical writings. And I'll talk about how those are actually directly connected. And his last work of history that I look at is Bharatiya Itihastil Sahasunare Pane, published in 1963, which is translated as 6 Glorious Epochs of Indian History in 1971, right? And so all the ideas that I've just laid out are unpacked with greater detail and greater kind of vigor for sort of explaining why this history is necessary in order to coming closer to Hindutva, right? So Hindutva is indefinable. We're looking for these historical actors. He goes from writing about the 19th century in his early works to start writing about antiquity and sort of the early modern period. And then finally, in his last work, goes all the way back to beginning with Alexander the Great. So you have this work, Savarkar, going further and further back. And one of the arguments that I make, the reason he keeps going further and further back, is to show that Hindus have always been violent, that Hindus have always maintained this idea of violence as central to their being. And that's part of the narrative strategy that he has, right? Now, he turns to history, and as I've just pointed out, that this is a very unorthodox history that he's writing in terms of seeking the essence and motives of these Hindu figures in the past. And he lays out multiple kind of methodological strategies, right? He talks about reading against the grain of colonial documents and Oriental research. The use of antonyms, right? So where the British might use a category of criminal or mutineer, he wants to use the category of the revolutionary. He argues for interviewing witnesses, writing a certain type of oral history. He also then turns to conjecture, right? Which is really interesting. He says that unless you can prove that it's false, I'm assuming it is true. And so this is one way for him to start talking about the epic traditions and various types of literature as being true historical texts, as opposed to conjecture itself or myth. And so he says conjecture, he sort of allows himself great latitude for thinking about how to write history through this idea of using conjecture, right? So most recently in this textbook that came out in Karnataka, the idea that Savarkar rode a bulbul across the Bay of Bengal to visit India while he was in the Andamans is a form of this kind of conjecture where you don't need fact or empirical evidence. You can sort of assert it, and unless you can prove it's not true, it is true, right? He takes the role of the omniscient narrator, and I mentioned this earlier, that he sort of says that he possesses the Hindu spirit, and this Hindu spirit has been traveling across time, and so therefore he can speak for people in the past, right? That he can sort of narrate what they were saying. He can feel what they were feeling. He can argue what they were arguing. And so he assumed this idea of this omniscient narrator, right? And he says that as a desiring, he starts talking about not only the desiring subjects that we talked about, right? These desiring subjects who have this motive, but he says as an author who seeks the desiring subjects, in a sense, the two Hindus come together at that moment, right? So I'm an author. I seek to write about these Hindus in the past. I claim to speak for them. I claim that I am brave and Veer, and I'm writing about them as Veer. I am a Hindu hero. I'm seeking Hindu heroes. And so you have this two categories that Savarkar uses in his work, that he is a writer of history, right? And he is a maker of history. And what he embodies, and this is the cover of the Savarkar collections, collected writing works. And what I thought was interesting is that the images here sort of illustrate the relationship between the writer of history and the maker of history. So Savarkar, as the writer of history, is seeking to write about the makers of history, these Hindu heroes who are Veer and brave. In that act, he becomes Veer and brave and becomes heroic. And today's Hindu history writers are writing about Savarkar, and then they become Veer and heroic in their very act of writing, right? So this cycle will continue, but for him, the centrality of writing this history, it's not just writing this history, the centrality of Hindutva is this very act itself. Very quickly, I don't have time to go through all of these kind of key select moments that I've kind of emphasized here, but they represent something very important for Savarkar, right? Is this idea that across time, the Hindu spirit traveled. It travels in these very acts. And for Savarkar, this becomes the most important thing to track as well, right? That the spirit, this essence, is what's very important in writing about, right? That if you write about these Hindu heroes in the past who were perpetuating this violence in the name of other Hindus, this is for him the most important. And what we know is that if we track these moments of violence, that in and of itself allows for us to understand this repetition of this cycle that goes on, and it will continue into the future, right? Very important, we talked about the Hindu colonization of Hindustan. He says Ramchandra's conquest of Lanka made Ramchandra sort of he said, and this is his terminology, not mine, that Ramchandra became the father of the nation in that very act, right? It was just the completion of the conquest that began in terms of the colonization of Hindustan. Vikramaditya appears throughout his early writings because Vikramaditya recolonized the territory, right? Prithviraj Chauhan becomes very important as this figure who is sort of the last Hindu emperor who, last Hindu king, before the arrival, he says, of various Muslims who started dominating the terrain. And this is a turning point. So Prithviraj Chauhan represents this moment of transition for Savarkar as well. The Peshwas, of course, is the arrival of the Peshwas was seen as this moment of Hindu revival. And coming back to 1857, and Mangal Pandey becomes the key figure, and his spirit travels. And Savarkar has a genealogy of how this Hindu spirit comes to him as well, which I think is really interesting, that he lays out this kind of genealogy of how within these key moments, he embodies the Hindu spirit, both as a writer and a maker of Hindu history. Simultaneously, as he's writing, of course, he has to address the issue of obstacles in Hindu history, right? And for him, some of the greatest obstacles are the Buddha and the Buddhists. And he says the Buddha and the Buddhists did something, especially, he goes back to Ashoka, and he says Ashoka did Hindus no favor by abandoning violence and becoming a Buddhist, right? And for him, this becomes an important moment where these Buddhist monks travel all over the world and tell the world about the Buddha and about India's great intellectual and other kinds of riches, and telling the world that India no longer has a theory of warfare. And it allows for greater, what he says, foreign invaders to come in. Again, these are his terms, not mine, to come in, Muslims, Christians, and so on. And it has allowed India to now become dominated, right? So he identifies the Buddhists or anyone who celebrates nonviolence as effeminate Hindus, which is a term. So if you look at pretty much all his works, at the end of his works, when he's offering an explanation as to what has happened in this period, he turns to the category of the effeminate Hindu and sort of says it's these effeminate Hindus who were not brave, who were not vir, who did not possess the Hindu spirit. They were the ones who are responsible for what's happening to India today. Okay, and he argues that that those who advocate nonviolence should have the most brutal killing. Right. So if you remember the story of Prahlad that I just went through, and the way that Vishnu resolves this problem in the form of Narsim is through this kind of brutal killing. And so he talks about this in his last work, about the necessity for these kind of brutal acts of violence against fellow Hindus who he says he identifies as effeminate Hindus, right? And so the Hindu is constantly stuck between this form of domination and victimhood, right? It's this binary that is a constant that is emerging over and over and over again. And of course, at the time that he's writing, the main individual who is advocating nonviolence at this time is Gandhi. And in 1909, there's a very interesting interaction between Gandhi and Savarkar in which they meet on Dussehra, and there's a conference. There's a celebration, and Gandhi says he will not participate in the events if there's a discussion of any politics. So Savarkar says, fine. However, they discuss the Ramayana and the necessity of the use of violence as an act in the Ramayana. And this becomes sort of the first public interaction between Gandhi and Savarkar on the issue of violence in and of itself. Okay. Now, what are the resolutions for a Hindutva future, right? And so Savarkar plays around with certain numbers of categories. He talks about assimilation or reconversion. I mean, this is something he's influenced by the Arya Samaj by. He talks about that Hindu history shows that something like the partition was a minor crisis, that if you look at temporally, this is where Hindus need to come together and embrace Hindutva rather than being defeated that the motherland, right, has been partitioned. And the way we're going to have the reunification of Hindustan is this perpetual or permanent war, a 1,000-year war that's going to move into the future. And he says Hindus have the capacity for the colonization of the globe, right? And that becomes quite central and quite important. I just wanted to kind of end with just reading a paragraph at the end of my book in the conclusion, in which I sort of argue that Savarkar's argument that the formation of Hindus, qua Hindus, was a process linked to colonialism and violence is central to any understanding of the meaning of Hindutva. Hindus were the perpetrators of violence who conquered and assimilated non-Hindus as Hindus in a process that can be described as dominance with hegemony. Savarkar considered this violence legitimate. Yet while he maintained that he abhorred all violence when perpetrated by a dominant force or entity, he believed it was justifiable for victims to seek vengeance against an oppressor. Hindus were in a permanent war as victims of the past, in which violence was necessary to negate unjust violence. The mere existence of a Muslim or Christian in India meant that the foreign invader was still present. The only resolution lay in the brave, in the vir, seeking vengeance, in what Etienne Balibar has called an infinite circularity of violence that has no end. The survival of Hindutva as an idea requires that we repeat this history, right? That every day that Hindus have been victims, and we now are seeking vengeance as a consequence of this victimhood. And if we get rid of this narrative, right, Hindutva may very well become hollowed without it, right? And so I kind of wanted to stop there and sort of pointing out that the survival of Hindutva, which is so dependent on this understanding of Hindutva as a history, needs this repetition, right? And the main individuals who object to this repetition are other fellow historians and other scholars and academics, right? People who have been practicing the writing of history as a disciplinary form, as a disciplinary epistemology. So if you see the kinds of targeting of historians and other academics, in part has to do with the fact that Hindutva itself is a history, right? The history that Savarkar has laid out and other Hindutva followers argue for a different kind of history that they are perpetuating. But the main challenge to those is this kind of analytical, empirically based disciplinary history that we have all also been struggling with for all sorts of reasons. But this is kind of sort of also the epistemological battleground that we're sort of experiencing in the Savarkar moment as well. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Chaturvedi, for that brilliant lecture. I'll just change it to the gallery mode. Yes, I can see you now. This is an important lecture because at the moment we are faced with a intellectual battle in the nation, where ideas which are alien to a lot of us because we have not read Savarkar and other scholars are being imposed on university campuses in different places, even in political arenas. So it is very important to have an open mind to discuss and understand the thought processes of people who were the founding fathers, so to say, of a dominant ideology of the time. So thank you so much for throwing such good light and important light on this subject of Savarkar and his idea of history, because the main reason of running Caravan is also to make people understand the importance of academic history and why academic history should be promoted in different places. So this really was a great introduction. There are many questions and there are different areas where we can explore. First is that you mentioned, there's an importance of reading Savarkar without being seen as a sympathizer of Savarkar. Because there's a fashion of calling somebody or tagging somebody if somebody reads something unconventional to their own understanding. and this blaming or these naming is very prominent in these times. So why, when you started reading Savarkar, what were the kind of challenges that you were faced with in your own experiences?
I mean, as I said at the beginning of the talk, I mean, it was mainly, interestingly enough, at certain kind of conferences where there was this kind of almost like an epistemic refusal to sort of say that that Savarkar could have had a thought, right? I mean, there was one conference I went to where, a fellow panelist said, I don't believe that Savarkar actually wrote anything. So how does one counter that, right? I mean, that it becomes a question of belief, right? That I believe, most recently, at one level, the challenge now that's imposed within India is that among certain circles, Savarkar has been declared a god, right? So according to the Indian constitution, criticizing a god in and of itself is a violation of the constitution, right? Of hurting religious sentiments. So how does one then actually provide a certain kind of commentary or critique? So one can critique certain sets of ideas, but again, the idea is that you cannot provide a certain kind of critique, both by those who are sympathetic to Savarkar, but those who are antagonistic to Savarkar, right? I was looking at even, going back to Jawaharlal Nehru, his wrote about that Hindu nationalism is not real, right? It's not a real nationalism. And I thought this was really interesting, right? And talking to various members, figures on the left in India over the last couple of decades, to even simply say that Hindu nationalism, you're corrected and sort of argued, and it's argued that this is an oxymoron. You cannot have the compound Hindu plus nationalism as a compound in the first instance, right? So it becomes there's the challenge of having a common terrain by which we can actually have a conversation, right? In and of itself becomes a challenge, right? Now, when you introduced today's talk, you chose not to mention Savarkar's name. And this was also at the very beginning, right? And I think this is also really interesting. I mean, there was a period where he was sort of like the Voldemort character in the Harry Potter series, where he is an individual who shall not be named, right? And I thought this was very interesting. Perhaps it was a political strategy, because Essentials of Hindutva is about naming. His first 80 pages of the book is really actually about naming. So by choosing not to name him, you're purposefully kind of countering this kind of argument, right? And this becomes, and I think these were sets of problems initially early on, or simply that Savarkar could not have said what you've said he says. And I said, well, you have to read him to know what he said. So there was an assumption that he simply could not have said certain kinds of things, influenced by certain kinds of thinkers, right? So the amount that he writes about Mazzini is extensive. The influence he says that he has by the Bible is extensive, right? That there was a period of his life where he said he was taken by the life of Jesus Christ. He was inspired by the life of Jesus Christ. He was inspired by Jesus Christ's suffering. So here you have, and so there's a refusal to talk about sort of the kind of Christian influences on Savarkar's thought as well, right? So you kind of unpack these uncomfortable thoughts, or even when I mentioned M.N. Roy, right? I mean, on the other side now, when I talk about M.N. Roy, there's a certain kind of epistemic refusal oftentimes, and sort of acknowledging that M.N. Roy did this, right? And I mean, in 1937, after Savarkar is released from all the conditions of his house arrest are removed, there's a Savarkar welcome committee that circulates, and Savarkar goes around Maharashtra in 1937. And when he comes to Mumbai, M.N. Roy contacts the organizer and says, I would like to introduce Savarkar, right? And so they are on the platform together. M.N. Roy celebrates Savarkar and then yet condemns him at the same time. Savarkar laughs, and Savarkar responds to M.N. Roy and says, M.N. Roy can't get beyond the fact of talking about socialism, but if it's a socialism for all Hindus, then I'm more than happy to be on board with M.N. Roy's platform. And then M. Roy writes one of his important books about condemning Hindus who attack Muslims. And in a sense, one could read that as a response to Savarkar. But that kind of a conversation could not exist today, right? The fact that that conversation, for example, was not covered by the media except for a couple of newspapers, the fact that people who write on M. Roy have chosen not to write about that, or the fact that people who write about Gandhi chose not to write about Savarkar or Ambedkar for many, many decades, right? So you have this kind of epistemic kind of refusal of engagement, which is seen as a form of political resistance. My argument is that I think the time has come to actually, if we don't understand what is the argument that's being made, it becomes very difficult to counter it. And here I think I agree with G.P. Deshpande in his work, that a Savarkar debate is what is going to counter and expose the sets of arguments about the nature of Hindutva and its violence against not simply the minority question regarding Christians and Muslims, but also against other Hindus, including the secularists, liberals, and Marxists as well, right? So in a sense, one has to have this kind of a conversation if we are trying to understand 20th century political thought and its impact on the 21st century.
Yes, and we have posted the link of Hindutva and Violence, V.D. Savarkar and the Politics of History on the YouTube live chat, so people can go and get the book also, because that is to understand Savarkar. I think it's a great way to indulge yourself by reading this book and reading the arguments in the book, some of which were presented today in the conversation. Coming to you, Professor Chaturvedi, your name is inspired from V.D. Savarkar, and there's an interesting story behind your naming, and you have written an article called Vinayak and I, the politics of renaming. I think it came out early. So renaming is very popular nowadays in India. Things are being renamed. Parliament is renamed. The Nehru Memorial Library is renamed. Everything is being renamed. It also shows the influence of Savarkar's idea of renaming. How do you see that, and how are your interaction with the son of Dr. Dr. Dattatreya Purandare, I think, if I'm not wrong, Parchure, Dr. Parchure, who also got the gun to Godse, which killed Gandhi. So tell us about that story, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, so I initially began this project after I had discovered, well, actually, I'll state it differently. My interest in part was this personal story that I was named after Savarkar as an infant, not by my parents, but by my pediatrician. And so when I discovered this story, I thought it was kind of both interesting and peculiar, and I wasn't sure what to do with it, and whether I should even talk about it, right? I mean, this is sort of, and so initially the idea was to interview Dr. Parchure, but he had passed away in 1985. So when I was in Gwalior in 2001, I discovered that the son, Dr. Parchure's son, was still alive and practicing Ayurvedic medicine in Gwalior. And so I interviewed him and to talk about his father's naming practices. And his father, after he had been released from prison, had agreed not to participate in public politics. And after Savarkar's death in 1966, he started naming as many boys as he could Vinayak as possible who came to his office. And his son said his father named hundreds upon hundreds male children Vinayak post 1966. And I happened to be one of them. He said I was the eighth Vinayak that he had actually met who had kept the name. And so it was. And the article then is now part of the book as well. It's part of the coda at the end of the book, in which I talk about kind of this relationship with the name itself, but also these naming practices. And as I said, the beginning of Essentials of Hindutva, the first 80 pages, is about the politics of naming, right? The importance of namings. And so when we look at the arguments that are put forward by politicians, and this is happening across the political spectrum, it's happening more right now with inserting Hindu names and changing names, but this has been going on for a while. I mean, the city of Bombay became Mumbai, in part because of this as well. All the city names that are changing from Allahabad to, other cities all over India. So this is a part of, the argument is that it's anti-colonial, but it's also something else. It's reinscribing a certain kind of Hindu identity into cities, into streets, into individuals as well, right? And there was a part of the interview in which Dr. Partray's son sort of said, the spirit of Savarkar now lives through you. And it hadn't occurred to me until I was finishing the book that the idea of the naming practice in part was to, again, spread the spirit of Savarkar everywhere. And now, you can wear the topi and you can be part of this everywhere Savarkar movement in which you sort of say, I am Savarkar too, right? So in a sense, it's now become democratized and liberalized where anyone can now claim to be Savarkar by embracing the Hindu spirit and identifying with Hindutva and this history, which now becomes this, sort of a hegemonic kind of formation in India overall. So that's part of how I began. My plan was not to convert that article into a book, but it sort of took over over the last decade and a half.
That brings me to this idea of thinking of the future of Savarkar's idea. What would happen, because it starts from renaming, then you showed the currency notes. So maybe relooking at the nation's ideals or father of the nation. Then how do you see, as a historian, how do you see the future of this idea? What would this monster of an idea would do later on?
I actually have a slide I didn't get to in my lecture, but I'll show you the slide, which kind of addresses this point. So if you look at this slide, this is, so outside of the headquarters where, Savarkar's work and family, where they are, in Mumbai and near Dadar, you have this map. It's the pre-partition map. Some would argue it's the map of Akhand Bharat, of undivided of India. You have Bharat Mata, right? You have Mother India. What's interesting here is Mother India's shackles are broken, right? So Mother India has been liberated. You don't have the tricolor flag. You have the flag that, whether one wants to talk about it as the Garu flag, the flag of Shivaji, to the flag of the Mahasabha, that she is holding. You have fire and light coming out. And what's interesting about this map is that it is identical to the map that's found in Savarkar's Indian War of Independence in 1857, right? So you have this British cartographic map that was used in Savarkar's 1909 book, which is the shadow behind Mother India here, right? And so I thought that was really interesting. I've written about this map in the book, and what I say is really interesting is that this is a British imperial map that reflects a certain kind of fantasy. The pink was usually used in British-controlled territory, so there's no princely states in this, right? There's no territory of the Portuguese or the French in this map. Instead, you have this complete conquest of India. But simultaneously, interestingly enough, it's the map that's used to describe Akhand Bharat as well, right? So you have this kind of overlay of this British imperial epistemology and technology that's now being used to talk about this undivided India that is now, right? But undivided India, why is the undivided India the map here, right? I mean, if you look, and part of it is, I think it's important to look at the chains, because if you look at the cover of, this edition of the Mazzini book, you have Mazzini also talks about the idea of breaking the shackles, the bonds of slavery. And Savarkar incorporates that into his 1857 book. But here, the bonds of slavery are bonds of slavery in which the Hindu is free, right? The Bharat Mata is free. She's no longer shackled. What is she not shackled by, right? So it's the reunification of Hindustan at one level. And does this mean that there are no Muslims and Christians and others living in India at this point, right? Is this symbolic of that? And so this is part of visually, if you just start paying attention to what is actually being put out there, visually you begin to see that the roadmap for a Hindutva future is already laid out, right? And so that's why I wanted to put the three images together to kind of show you how the three are connected. And Savarkar, of course, is leading the path in this, sort of visual representation here forward, right? So I just thought that juxtaposition is kind of interesting as well.
No, that's really interesting, and I want to ask another question, but I will take some audience questions also around, and then I'll come back to my question. This is a question by Sagar Tiwari. His question is, for Savarkar, why and under what conditions does the gender of a nation changes from Matra Bhumi, which we see Bharat Mata in 1857 book, to the Pitra Bhumi, fatherland in Hindutva? How do you see the transformation of Savarkar's idea?
Yeah. So in part two of the book, I sort of talk about this, and there are three moments for Savarkar, right? And you have to understand all three together. The motherland, the fatherland, the holy land, right? So the motherland is important to understand because this is one's mother, right? So symbolically, Bharat Mata represents the mother, and we have to understand that all Hindus should claim this as their motherland. Now, the problem, of course, is, Savarkar points out, that there are also Christians and Muslims, Jews and Zoroastrians, who also can claim Bharat Mata as their own because they were also born on this land, right? He has an entire argument about blood, which is really important as well, that there's this kind of blood lineage, but I won't get into that just yet. The fatherland, he actually takes, a lot of people will argue that he's building this from German thought, Nazi thought, but he's actually getting it from Mazzini. Mazzini is talking about the fatherland. There's whole discourses of the fatherland in the 19th century that Savarkar is exposed to. So the fatherland is a territory that one can also stake a claim in. But again, for him, the problem that is that even if one has the blood of a Hindu, you can convert to Islam or Christianity. So you can claim the motherland and the fatherland, even as a Muslim, even as a Christian. However, he adds the third category of holy land and says that this is our holy land. As Muslims look towards Mecca, Christians and Jews look towards Jerusalem, Hindus will look towards this land, right? And so, so therefore he can sort of separate the Christian, the Muslim, the Zoroastrian, and the Jew from the territory. These individuals could claim it as motherland and as fatherland, but they cannot claim it as holy land, right? So I would, so for the person who asked the question, I would say the third category that's most important for Savarkar is the holy land there as well, right? So he lays out one argument for motherland, he lays out another argument for fatherland, and then he says the ultimate argument is the combination of the two plus the holy land.
The next question is by a senior journalist, Mehru Jafar. A question is, did Savarkar advocate the killing of fellow citizens to realize a Hindu nation? What would Savarkar say to the cruel way that the country is administered today?
Well, I mean, as a historian, it becomes very difficult to know what Savarkar would think today. So I would refrain from the second part of that question, from answering the second part of the question. But the first part of the question, I think, I mean, and I write about this in the last part of the book, in which I sort of talk about Savarkar's arguments about the necessity of violence against other Hindus, against fellow Hindus as well, right? That there's a certain kind of emphasis regarding the need for violence against those who argue for nonviolence, right? Now, one could argue that this is sort of a metaphor for talking about Gandhi and Gandhians, but he leaves it sort of open-ended. Now, so yes, I mean, at one level, yes, he is arguing for violence as being part of being a Hindu. In order to create a Hindu Rashtra, one has to participate in this violence, right? I mean, he has, and maybe one way to answer this question is sort of, I mean, it kind of reminds me of Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, where Savarkar says that a Hindu sitting somewhere in North India reads the newspaper and reads a report of an attack on a Hindu in let's say South India or West India. That Hindu then goes and randomly attacks a Muslim or a Christian in North India, in a sense, completes their identity as a Hindu, because you have identified yourself with the person who was attacked somewhere else, right? Irrespective of what that was, right? And so I think it's important to keep that in mind as well, that he doesn't fully articulate this explicitly for what is to be done, but it is what is to be done is part of the message of the story, right? The reason he's writing these histories going back in time is to show that and lay the foundation that Hindus have always been violent. And if we look at the conversations about the Hindutva futures that are going on, there's a new 1,000-year war. That's the nature of violence as well, right? I mean, so I think there are already a lot of, I mean, whether one wants to watch a Netflix series like Layla, which is futuristic of creating this new nation of Aryabhat, or read novels, or so you already have a certain kind of Hindutva futurism that's no longer part of the future. It's actually part of the present as well that's happening.
The next question is by Amit Bhagat. As a historian, to what extent did Savarkar approach the writing of history with scholarly rigor? Was there any scholarly rigor in his historical writings? How faithfully did he engage with and interpret these historical sources? So was Savarkar a historian in any sense of it?
Right. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, Savarkar, okay, there's two ways to think about this. I mean, one is Savarkar spends over a decade in the Andamans. He's imprisoned for 14 years. He's under house arrest or limited restrictions for until 1937. So basically the period between 1910 and 1937, he's restricted. He writes that he has limited access to books in certain periods. In other periods, he has access to lots of books, but limited access to paper. So a lot of what he's writing off the top of his head in the early phases. But once he's under house arrest, his writings proliferate extensively. Now, if we look at Essentials of Hindutva as one place, and if we look at this Saha Sunaripane at the end of his career, he's making an effort to sort of say, look, I am a researcher. I read Oriental research. I'm familiar with Oriental research. I'm familiar with the main historians of the day. I'm familiar with the vernacular tradition. So he cites a whole range of texts in Essentials of Hindutva, arguing that but he's writing this in prison, so he has limited access. But in terms of, he actually cites, he cites letters from Shivaji. So he cites letters from other historical figures, and probably these are the compilations of scholars like Rajwade or and others who are collecting Maratha documents, and he may have had access to some of those. In the Andamans, he has an access to an extensive library. I mean, he writes about some of the books that he has access to. So we know that he's reading extensively. Now, is he a historian in the disciplinary formation of historian? No, he is not. He makes claims that he is, that he's interested in historical method. He's interested in facts and evidence. He's interested in certain sets of debates. I have a whole discussion about how Savarkar locates himself within sort of Maratha historiography of the time, between Jadunath Sarkar at one level and G.S. Sardesai at another level. There's an interaction between Savarkar and G.S. Sardesai that is really important, and I write about that as well. So Savarkar is familiar with the entire Maratha tradition of history writing, both in Marathi and in English. But when you read his works, you sort of get a sense that this is not the history that we're interested in, or as historians. So when his book on the Marathas comes out, it doesn't get reviewed. It gets reviewed only in a couple of places. There's a professor of Sanskrit in London, at the University of London, who reviews his book and says, this is sort of nonsensical. This is not a scientific spirit. But in fact, he actually identifies the main purpose of Savarkar's book, which is it's the Hindu spirit that Savarkar is interested in, right? And Savarkar's problem with someone like Jadunath Sarkar is that Jadunath Sarkar is so interested in doing research and actually getting facts and details and spending so much time doing it that he doesn't focus on the essence of the Hindu, right? And so I think there are two separate projects. The term history or itihas becomes the shared commonality. But if you want to think of it, that Savarkar is trying to rethink the category of history with the idea that he's going to link it with Hindutva forever, right? And that's the challenge, because historians will say this is not history. It doesn't look like history. It doesn't feel like history. And Savarkar's point would be, exactly, I'm not interested in writing an analytical history or an academic history. I'm interested in writing a history that will inspire you to become a maker of history, becoming veer, becoming brave, and so that cycle can continue in which you now embody the Hindu spirit and use acts of violence as a way of creating the Hindu Rashtra, right? So for him, that's more important in terms of rethinking what we mean by history overall. So, right, so these academic debates that we have in India, or the criticisms of academics who are outside of India that you don't know what history is, that's kind of what they're talking about, right? They're not interested in the analytical or academic. They're interested in the affective and a history that reflects the Hindu spirit. You see this happening in cinema too, whether you watch RRR or you watch Bahubali or you watch any of the new heroic films that are coming out, or films of these Bravehearts. I mean, it's sort of they're taking the Amarchitra Katha categories and using them for cinema, and to create this kind of heroic, these heroic films, these hagiographies that are dominating sort of cinema now as well.
So Savarkar was more interested in proving a point rather than developing a rigor of any sort. He was just trying to maybe promote his ideas by citing favorable sources, which goes against the ethics of history as laid by various scholars in the West, like Carr or others, and India also. There are questions, I think, for you from... We'll take two more questions maybe from the audience, and then I'll come back to some of my questions. This is by Aritra Ganguly. Did Savarkar talk about women in Essentials of Hindutva? Because there are many questions being raised on Savarkar's position on women and his age-old traditions of where he maybe cite Manusmriti's position on women. So what's your take on it?
So, yes, I mean, women if you're looking at Essentials of Hindutva, less so there, but in in his book on 1857 and his last book, and mentions in his Maratha book, right? So you have, there's multiple ways to answer this question. I mean, one is yes, that he has references to the Manusmriti in Essentials of Hindutva, in which he's talking about different forms of marriages that that he's actually quite open to, and it opens up the caste question especially as well, right? That Savarkar is, as someone who is both writing about and arguing for interdining, temple entry, and intermarriage between castes as central to thinking about creating an idea of this unified Hindu category that he's interested in, right? So at that level, he's the Orthodox Brahmins in Maharashtra are very angry with him. There's lots of petitions that are written against him for these sets of arguments that he's making that are violating, they say, Orthodox Brahmanism in Maharashtra, right? So there are incidents of chappals being thrown and rocks being thrown at Savarkar's processions by members of Sanatan Dharma who are upset by Savarkar's arguments about intermarriage and interdining. And so this in part is related to the question about that. But Savarkar also has references to, for example, women warriors that he's very interested in at one level, right? That you have, he says, Maratha sailors who were women. He says you have these women warriors in the early modern period. So he has references. Women have the potential to becoming brave and veer. He uses the Rani of Jhansi as an exemplar case of an individual who is, as a woman, interested in embodying the Hindu spirit as being a warrior. So for him, the centrality of this Hindu identity that he's interested in is in part about being a warrior, right? So he seeks out these warriors in the past, these brave hearts in the past, these individuals he calls veer, but they're by no means only men at that level, but they're mostly men in his writings at the same time, right? So he has these kind of categories in terms of questions of gender. He's very interested in the category of the masculine Hindu and the effeminate Hindu, right? That someone like Rani of Jhansi has a masculine death, whereas many Hindu men have effeminate deaths because they're not fighting. They're either committing suicide. He has a whole discourse on suicide. So you have Savarkar's arguments that bleed in all sorts of categories. I mean, he has an entire text on the Manusmriti and rethinking of the Manusmriti, and both in terms of caste and in terms of gender. Simultaneously, I mean, again, he's not, there's no one single answer to the question. I mean, he writes an essay called A Woman's Duty and Beauty, in which he argues that it's not necessary for women to get an education, right? So he's part of a certain 19th century Maharashtrian kind of ethos regarding education. But yet at another level, he's interested in sort of intermarriage or women becoming warriors at the same time. So I would say it's a complex set of answers to, because there's no one way to answer that question, but he does address this extensively throughout his work, his body of work.
Yeah, the next question I think you already answered about the saffronization of Indian history and how Savarkar's idea are being thrusted upon in various of your answers today. The question I would like to pose is about a very famous critique of Savarkar in political realms today, that is his mercy petitions, and where Gandhi also comes in the conversation, saying Gandhi asked Savarkar to write mercy petitions. Mm-hmm. And what's your take on this whole debate on Savarkar's mercy and the question of his virta, so to say, because he called himself a veer in Essentials of Hindutva. How do you see this whole debate?
I wish it would go away, to be honest with you. I mean, because I think it's the wrong place to emphasize and the wrong thing to focus on. I mean, at one level, did Savarkar use the word beg? I beg your honor. Did he ask for mercy in his petitions? He used those terms. Yes, he did. He asked for but he's also a lawyer, like Gandhi was, like many other nationalist figures who were lawyers. There were certain conventions of writing. So you could look at Gandhi's writings. You could look at Karl Marx's writings. You could look at Benjamin Franklin's writings. You could look at from the late 18th century onwards throughout the 19th century in the English language for the various salutations of ending formal letters use the word beg. And it's not beg as in begging for money, begging for food, being a beggar. It's, in the same way that if you bump into someone, you say, I beg your pardon, it's no longer used, but this was a common phrase. It's not asking, So yes, the term in English has multiple meanings. And so at one level, I'm less convinced about that. Now, politically, yes, you can use that as a political tactic to denounce someone if you want, and that's fine. I mean, and people have been doing it. I mean, you just have to go on hashtag Savarkar on social media and see the various memes that are printed about Savarkar as a way of denouncing Savarkar. So this is part of that process. But if you're asking whether, for me, that is a question that that is of relevance for thinking about Savarkar, I'm not sure that it is. Now, for his supporters, everything that he did, I mean, and for some, now that he's been declared a god, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, the Buddha also begged for food, right? I mean, so it's not as if that is a certain thing that's unusual to Savarkar. Now, what is unusual, and I've said this in a couple of lectures, and I got into a little bit of, is that Savarkar, when he writes the last round of petitions before he's finally released from the Andamans, is quite ill, right? He's been stricken with malaria. He has tuberculosis. His body weight is down to about 95 pounds. And he writes to his brother that I don't think I'm going to survive. So can you please try to get me out of here, because I don't think I can live through this. So, I mean, at another level, he's someone who's quite ill. And again, once when I said that he was quite ill and when he wrote some of these letters, I was accused of trying to humanize Savarkar, right? So the binary of whether you elevate Savarkar to the point where he's not a human anymore, he's a god, or to talk about him as someone who has human suffering somehow humanizes him, again, takes us away from the real problems at hand in terms of the arguments that he's making. Now, like I said, politically, sure, if you want to use this as a way of denouncing him, that's fine. I mean, but it's not something that, and I begin the book by saying that part of me does not want to be involved in these, this book is not about those sets of conversations. Because in a certain way, once you begin those conversations, you can't get out of those conversations because there's no answer, right? Except that, did he use the word beg? Yes, he did. Did he use it in the way that he's being accused of? Probably not, right? And so does this, I think what's more interesting in thinking about how Savarkar became Veer Savarkar was his own role in writing his own autobiographies, writing his own biography, contributing to others who are writing his own biography. I mean, in my book, I track that pretty much every single biography that was written about Savarkar up till his death in 1966, including Dhananjay Keer's two editions of his biography, he had an active role in managing his reputation. I mean, he was a great marketer in that sense, right? We talk about Twitter as being sort of great form of self-marketing. Savarkar had this down in a real sophisticated way. I mean, for half a century, if you can manage every single biography that comes out and articulate what you wanted to articulate, and that is the legacy that continues in the hagiographies of today, that what Savarkar managed as his reputation to becoming Veer Savarkar, right? the more he wrote about these heroic figures in the past, the more he was identified as being heroic. So that circularity that I put up as a writer and maker of history is precisely that, right? The more he engaged in that, the more he became identified as Veer. And the more he celebrated the fact that others were calling him Veer over and over in his writings. So it was this kind of circular art, circularity of elevation, to the extent that today it has worked, right?
No, it's important that you have mentioned all these, and I hope that this will help a lot of young scholars and people who are listening to us or might be listening to us later to understand, because when we make historical figures larger than life, like you said, godlike figures, it is difficult to see the ills in them, or it is difficult to see them humans. So what you have done is to attempt at understanding the person behind Savarkar, the politician behind Savarkar, the writer behind Savarkar, and how he has used his writings to create a roadmap for his ideals to be implemented in future. So it was not just a textual understanding of his idea, but he also gave a roadmap of how they can realize the Hindutva dream. And whatever is happening in today's India is kind of the whole opening up of that Pandora's box, and there's a lot of things to uncover in times to come. But I hope this book, people who read this book will understand a lot of intricacies of Savarkar as a person and the many lives that he led, like Mahatma Gandhi, like Nehru, and like Bose. Savarkar has emerged as a new figure in the understanding of Indian history for the last 7-8 years, and he is now continuing to dominate all the other uh, freedom fighters or national ideals that there were before Savarkar. Thank you so much, Professor Chaturvedi, for this conversation. We'll record some videos after this lecture, and that you all can see on YouTube, on our Instagram, where we'll ask very short questions to Professor Chaturvedi, and we'll try to understand a lot of things through that, because we are trying this new short form contents, where we can answer some critical questions on historical themes that can engage a lot of young people. Because this the reason for today's lecture was also to make you all understand the layers of history that are there, even when we talk of a figure who is either idealized or is villainized by all sorts of people. And when we see the dangers of the ideas that were written by Savarkar, it is important to talk about him, to debate about his legacy, his writings, with scholars. And because over the last few years, there are many hagiographies that have come up, but very rarely we find books that critically evaluate a figure like Savarkar. So the link is in the chat. We'll also put the link of the book in the description of this video. So if you are listening till here, please go and get the book via Amazon in India. I hope this is available in bookstores also. So get your copy, read, and then please write to us on carvanheritage@gmail.com with your thoughts, with your questions. We'll be happy to forward them to Professor Chaturvedi, who can get back to you via email. Thank you so much, everybody. We plan to host many more sessions on historical figures, trying to understand their life, works, and legacy, especially from all the wings and all the political spectrums. So not limiting it to either one or the other side, to make this platform more diverse and more open in our approach. Thank you so much, everybody. Take good care. Keep reading, keep questioning, and keep thinking, because these times require that more than ever. Thank you so much, Professor Chaturvedi. I'll end the live now, and let's see.